18 hours before my wedding, I found a silver gift bag filled with white tissue paper sitting on my cousin Sierra's dresser. Inside was a 12-week ultrasound. Attached was a note written in my fiancé Julian's distinct handwriting. It read, "Our little secret. I already love you both more than I can say." I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. Beside the gift bag lay a secondary phone, its screen lighting up with a new message notification. I unlocked it effortlessly, as Julian always used his birth year as the passcode, and I scrolled through a 14-month ledger of pure deceit. It was not a sudden mistake. It was an ongoing subscription to betrayal. And I had been the silent investor footing the bill. I did not panic, and I did not dissolve into desperate tears. I simply picked up my phone and called Julian. When he answered, sounding groggy and completely unaware that his separate ledgers had just merged into a singular deficit, I delivered 4 cold sentences. I know about Sierra. I know about the baby. The ceremony is permanently canceled. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. I hung up immediately, blocking his number before he could even draw a breath to negotiate. I drove to my parents' house in complete silence. The cool night air felt clarifying, stripping away any lingering illusions I held about my relationship. When I arrived, I presented the facts to my mother like an auditor delivering a final, undeniable report. She spent the remainder of the night making methodical, necessary phone calls, vendor by vendor, contract by contract. We systematically dismantled the entire event. We forfeited $78,000 in non-refundable deposits by midnight. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon some sense of profound regret for the lost capital, but there was only absolute clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and I was decisively cutting my losses. Just past 2 a.m, Aunt Kimberly and Uncle Donald burst through the front door, the silence of the house shattering under their chaotic entry. Kimberly's face was flushed red, her voice shrill as she immediately began defending the indefensible. She demanded grace. She demanded forgiveness for the sake of the unborn baby, treating Julian's infidelity not as a devastating breach of contract, but as a minor clerical error that we needed to overlook for the family's overall portfolio. Donald stood firmly behind her, nodding along as if he were negotiating a hostile merger where I was expected to cheerfully concede all my assets. Watching them frantically attempt to secure my compliance, I realized the full, devastating extent of my own vulnerability. I had spent my entire life functioning as the ultimate peacemaker, absorbing their toxic debts to keep the familial accounts perfectly balanced. This is the survivor's invisible chain. When you grow up conditioned to meticulously manage everyone else's emotional liabilities, you become the perfect, compliant target for exploitation. You convince yourself that your endless capacity to understand, to endure, and to forgive is a profound strength, when in reality, it is a psychological prison. I had inadvertently facilitated my own betrayal by constantly proving I was strong enough to survive it. They were not shocked by what Julian and Sierra had done. They were genuinely shocked that I had decisively stopped playing along. I looked at Kimberly, her mouth still moving, still demanding that I absorb this massive emotional deficit, and I told them to leave. My overfunctioning days were completely over, and their access to my emotional capital was permanently revoked. Cut off entirely from the toxic faction of my family, I began the rigorous process of liquidating their influence from my life. Aunt Kimberly immediately launched an aggressive smear campaign to protect her own daughter's market value. She painted me to the extended family and local community as a cold, career-obsessed woman who had driven Julian away through neglect. Simultaneously, Julian and Sierra flooded their social media feeds with smug, perfectly curated family photos, showcasing their new life as if it were a legitimate acquisition rather than stolen property. I refused to engage with their public relations strategy. Instead, I diverted all my energy into therapy and career advancement, recognizing that the best response was an impenetrable fortress of personal success. I threw myself into my role as a marine restoration project lead. The ocean does not negotiate, it requires meticulous planning, absolute dedication, and structural integrity to heal. I applied those exact same principles to my own life. Through intensive therapy, I painstakingly mapped out my trauma, isolating my triggers and rebuilding my autonomy brick by brick. By year 3, I had secured a major promotion and a substantial salary increase. My personal stock was rising, unburdened by the parasitic drain of my former relatives. It was during this period of aggressive expansion that I met Garrett. He was a coastal structural engineer consulting on one of my largest restoration sites. Unlike Julian, who had always viewed my success as a competitive threat to his own ego, Garrett approached our relationship as a true partnership. He was emotionally secure, analytical, and entirely unthreatened by an independent woman. When my old panic triggers flared up remnants of the survivor's chain I was still working to break, Garrett did not react with frustration or demand immediate compliance. Instead, he patiently unpicked the tangled wiring of my anxiety with the same methodical precision he applied to reinforcing seawalls against a storm surge. Our relationship was built on a foundation of absolute transparency and mutual respect. There were no hidden ledgers, no secret communications, and no unspoken resentments. Love, I finally realized, did not have to be a high-risk investment with terrible returns. After 2 years of building a quiet, deeply secure life together, Garrett proposed. It was not a grandiose, performative spectacle designed for public consumption. It happened on a random Tuesday evening, standing beside the small, thriving lemon tree we had planted together in our own backyard. It was simple, undeniable, and structurally sound. I said yes with absolute certainty, knowing my assets were finally secure. We began planning a modest, private, coastal wedding, carefully insulating our guest list to ensure only those who had actively contributed to our growth were invited. My toxic relatives remained entirely excluded from the prospectus. I had successfully audited my life, removed the bad debts, and secured a partner who valued my true net worth. We were building an unbreakable foundation, entirely immune to the chaotic fluctuations of the past. 5 years after the disastrous implosion of my first engagement, I received an entirely unexpected communication. It was an email from Aunt Kimberly. She claimed that a recent severe health scare had radically transformed her perspective on family and forgiveness. Her message was overflowing with manufactured sentimentality, culminating in an astonishing financial proposition. She was offering to wire $86,000 to completely cover the entire budget for my upcoming coastal wedding. She explicitly stated it was a gift, a peace offering designed to wipe the slate clean and welcome me back into the familial fold. I read the email 3 times, analyzing the text for hidden clauses. My immediate instinct was to reject the capital outright. I knew my aunt better than anyone. She never made an investment without expecting a hostile takeover in return. However, Garrett, ever the pragmatic engineer, reviewed the offer and saw a unique opportunity. If Kimberly wanted to relinquish $86,000 of liquidity to assuage her own manufactured guilt, we could accept the funds provided we established ironclad, impenetrable legal boundaries. We were not going to be bought, but we were perfectly willing to let her finance the celebration under our exclusive, non-negotiable terms. Anticipating profound manipulation, Garrett and I consulted with a legal professional to meticulously armor our contracts. We drafted a formal agreement dictating that the $86,000 must be wire transferred unconditionally. To ensure absolute insulation, we directed the transfer not into our personal accounts, but directly into an isolated, dedicated vendor escrow account managed by a third-party legal representative. The terms explicitly stated the funds were a non-refundable gift with 0 stipulations regarding event planning, guest list management, or venue control. Kimberly signed the agreement and transferred the funds, clearly under the delusion that money inherently guaranteed authority. She was gravely mistaken. With the capital secured in escrow, I proceeded to execute the next phase of our defensive strategy. I personally signed every single document associated with the wedding. The historic waterfront estate venue, the premium coastal catering company, the florists, and the security personnel. Every contract bore my signature and my signature alone. I was the sole legal client on record. I granted Kimberly and Uncle Donald absolutely 0 legal leverage, no authorized contact with the vendors, and no administrative power over the event's execution. We had successfully accepted the Trojan horse and immediately stripped it of all its hidden soldiers. Kimberly believed she had purchased a controlling stake in my wedding, a golden ticket to force her way back into my life and orchestrate a public display of familial reconciliation. She was entirely unaware that her massive financial contribution had purchased her absolutely nothing. The barricades were fully reinforced, the contracts were legally bulletproof, and Garrett and I prepared to host our wedding on our own uncompromising terms, completely insulated from their toxic influence. They had attempted to weaponize their wealth, treating my special day as another asset to acquire. Instead, they had merely subsidized my happiness while remaining legally and practically locked out of the entire transaction. An hour before we were scheduled to exchange our vows at the historic waterfront estate, the anticipated breach occurred. Despite our strict security measures, Kimberly had managed to extract the location from a loose-lipped floral assistant. I was standing in the bridal suite, observing the grounds through the window, when a chaotic procession approached the main security gate. It was Sierra, brazenly attempting to crash the perimeter while wearing an elaborate, heavily beaded bridal gown of her own. She was accompanied by Julian and their 2 young children, while Aunt Kimberly marched at the front of the phalanx, loud and demanding. Kimberly was clearly orchestrating a forced, highly performative public reconciliation, pointing cameras in our direction to capture the ambush for her social media followers. I did not panic. I simply nodded to Garrett, and we moved to intercept them on the sprawling front lawn. We were immediately flanked by my brother Lucas, standing tall and imposing in his formal Coast Guard uniform, alongside Garrett's 3 heavily built brothers. The physical barricade was established before Kimberly could even begin her theatrical monologue. "We paid for this wedding," Kimberly shrieked, gesturing wildly at the estate. "We have every right to be here, and we demand to be seated." She looked at Sierra, who was posing in her bridal gown, clearly waiting for a dramatic sisterly embrace. I stepped forward, my voice coldly detached. "You paid a vendor escrow account under a legally binding gift agreement," I corrected her. "You do not own this event." I pulled a copy of the venue contract from my coordinator's folder and held it up. I methodically exposed the fundamental reality of their situation. This is the illusion of power in an empty purse. They believed that flashing a large check granted them unquestionable authority, forgetting that true power lies in legal ownership and contractual boundaries. They had surrendered their capital without securing a single signature on the operational documents. Because these contracts bear my signature and mine alone, I stated clearly, ensuring the 70-seated guests witnessing the spectacle could hear every word, "You hold absolutely no authority here. Your financial leverage is a complete illusion." Kimberly's face drained of color as the mathematical certainty of my statement registered. She looked frantically toward the venue manager, who simply nodded in agreement with me. They had zero jurisdiction. Before Kimberly could pivot to a new manipulation tactic, Grandmother Eleanor stepped forward from the front row of chairs. She brandished her silver-tipped cane, pointing it directly at Donald and Kimberly. "You are a disgrace to this family's name," Eleanor announced, denouncing the intruders with absolute, unyielding authority. The 70 guests, realizing the severity of the intrusion, stood up in unison, forming a human wall. Flanked by Lucas and the estate's security personnel, I issued my final directive: leave this property immediately, or you will be arrested for criminal trespassing. Stripped of their perceived power, the crashers turned and fled. The sight of Sierra dragging her ridiculous bridal gown across the gravel driveway while Julian scrambled to keep up with her was the ultimate confirmation of our victory. The transaction was complete, the intruders were publicly expelled, and Garrett and I proceeded to exchange our vows in absolute, unbothered peace. The ambush had failed completely. 3 weeks after our flawless wedding, the symmetrical ruin of their toxic faction was fully realized. It began when Grandmother Eleanor, thoroughly disgusted by the ambush at the estate, launched a quiet but aggressive audit into Donald and Kimberly's finances. She forced Donald into a corner, threatening to cut him out of her own substantial will unless he confessed the exact origin of the $86,000 wire transfer. The truth, when it finally emerged, was a masterpiece of financial incompetence. The $86,000 was never theirs to give. It was a fabricated asset built entirely on a mountain of unsustainable debt. The funds had not come from Kimberly and Donald's savings, nor were they a genuine gesture of familial goodwill. It was a fraudulent, incredibly high-interest, leveraged loan that Donald had desperately taken out against his own struggling contracting firm. They had gambled, borrowed, heavily penalized money to buy a public PR stunt, hoping to use my wedding to project an image of wealth and stability they no longer possessed. Their balance sheets were effectively bleeding out, and the desperate loan only accelerated their impending bankruptcy. They had literally mortgaged their future for a chance to ruin my present, and the resulting interest payments were rapidly destroying their remaining capital. Simultaneously, a profound stroke of karmic justice balanced the scales of Julian and Sierra's fraudulent marriage. The night before their own anniversary, Sierra was searching for a receipt in Julian's leather briefcase and discovered a hidden, secondary burner phone. The symmetry of the betrayal was almost poetic. She unlocked the device and uncovered definitive proof of his 8-month affair. The devastating twist? Julian had been sleeping with Sierra's own brand manager, the very woman responsible for curating her pristine lifestyle influencer image. The public humiliation was absolute and unavoidable. The fallout was swift and mercilessly clinical. Donald's contracting firm, already struggling under poor management, began bleeding crucial clients as word of the community scandal and their unstable finances spread. The local market simply refused to do business with a family so publicly entangled in fraud and public humiliation. With his professional reputation destroyed by the scandal and his personal life imploding, Julian filed for divorce. To ensure maximum damage, he aggressively demanded full custody of their children. Citing Sierra's unstable public meltdowns as proof of her unfitness, Sierra's meticulously crafted online persona was completely obliterated by the explosive divorce proceedings, rendering her influencer career completely toxic to potential sponsors. I watched their entire empire collapse from a safe, comfortable distance. I did not gloat, and I did not reach out to offer sympathy. They had built their foundation on deceit, exploitation, and performative wealth. I simply observed the natural, inevitable consequences of poor investments and moral bankruptcy. Their ledger was finally in the red, and the universe had ruthlessly collected its outstanding debts, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the ruins of their own terrible choices. With the toxic faction of the family completely neutralized by their own catastrophic failures, I took the final, decisive steps to ensure our complete protection. I instructed our legal counsel to draft and enforce a formal, ironclad cease and desist letter against Julian, Sierra, Kimberly, and Donald. The document unequivocally severed all ties, warning that any further attempt to contact us or interfere with our lives would result in immediate, aggressive legal action. I then sat down with my mother and instituted a strict, non-negotiable communication boundary. She was to permanently stop relaying any family gossip or updates regarding their ongoing collapse. I had no interest in their deficits. Their dramatic downfall was no longer a part of my reality, and I refused to let their chaos pollute the pristine environment Garrett and I had worked so incredibly hard to construct. Living in true peace miles away from the wreckage of my former relatives, Garrett and I focused entirely on our own positive investments. We spent our weekends deliberately building our future, culminating in the quiet joy of finishing the paint on the walls of our soft yellow coastal nursery. It was a space designed for warmth, security, and absolute unconditional love, everything my extended family had failed to provide. As I stood in that peaceful room, observing the life we had successfully engineered, I finally understood the true mechanics of personal autonomy. This is the profound truth about releasing bloodlines to reclaim your self-sovereignty. Society conditions us to view biological connections as permanent, inescapable contracts. We are told that we must constantly absorb the debts of our relatives simply because we share a genetic ledger. But unconditionally financing the toxic behavior of family members is a predatory expectation. It demands that you bankrupt your own emotional reserves to keep their dysfunctional systems afloat. True loyalty is not an automatic right granted by birth. It is a premium asset that must be consistently earned through mutual respect, honesty, and verifiable trust. Severing a toxic bloodline is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of fiduciary responsibility to your own soul. Looking back on the 18 hours before my first wedding and the 5 years of rigorous rebuilding that followed, I feel no resentment. I've come to realize that surviving betrayal isn't just about walking away. It is about having the unwavering courage to build something entirely new from the wreckage. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free, allowing you to finally close the account and move forward without dragging the heavy anchors of the past behind you. I chose to forgive myself for ever believing I was responsible for their dysfunction, and in doing so, I secured a lifetime of peace. Have you ever had a toxic family member try to buy their way back into your life with zero genuine remorse? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs the strength to protect their boundaries today.